Maybe we should wait another. So I think in the interest of time, we will just get started and leave the doors open for a moment here. I will try not to fall off this cliff because we have such a huge panel here. I'm trying to be safe. Welcome to all of you, and thank you to the team of the Belgrade Security Forum for giving us this opportunity here. My name is Janka, Oertel, and I'm a Transatlantic Fellow in the Asia Program of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We have been tasked by the organizers to talk about the Asian century. Has it begun? What is that supposed to mean? Does it make sense to use this framing? Or does that talk about the Asian century merely disguise the fact that Europe and the US have lost relative weight in international relations? That an order we had gotten used to is somehow dissolving, and that we actually are not quite sure what's going to be next. As you can tell from this outline is that we have just a few little tiny questions to address. Global power shifts, the future of international economic order, emerging great power rivalry. Should not be difficult to do that with this stellar panel in 90 minutes. I'm certain we can at least take a stab at it and provide some creative thoughts on whether and where the center of gravity in world politics is moving and what this may mean for us. Before we get right into the conversation, please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. To my right is Leonard Bernardo, the Vice President of the Open Society Foundations. He began his work with the Open Society Foundations at the Soros Foundation in Moscow, and while he has written a book about the second lives of US presidents as citizens-in-chief, I will refrain from asking him to speculate about what we'll have to expect from President Trump in this realm, and rather have him share his thoughts on where the US is headed in its relations with Russia and China, and what greater relative weight of authoritarians means for human rights and democracy worldwide. To his right is Shada. She's the Director of Europe and Geopolitics at Friends of Europe, and she's also a visiting professor at the College of Europe, where she teaches Asia-Europe relations, and a fellow at the Free University in Brussels. Politico has named her one of the 20 most influential women in Brussels, and as she is an author of the Frankly Speaking commentary series, we are looking forward for her to do exactly that, speak frankly, Shada. To her right, Jens Bastian. He's an independent economic consultant and financial sector analyst. He knows a lot about the strengths and weaknesses of Greece's financial system, but he has also recently worked extensively on Chinese investment in Southeast Europe, a trend that has become much more relevant, especially here in Belgrade. To his right is Alexander Gabuev, a senior fellow and the chair of the Russia and the Asia Pacific program at Carnegie Moscow Center. Before becoming one of the most renowned scholars and media commentators on China-Russia relations, he was a journalist at the newspaper Kommersant. He speaks English, Russian, and Chinese, as well as German, all four of them as if they were his mother tongue, which could be considered a pretty big strategic advantage in a globalized world. To his right is Professor Pant. He's a distinguished fellow and director of research at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. Additionally, he serves as professor of international relations at King's College in London and as non-resident fellow at CSIS in Washington, D.C. He's an expert on Asian security issues and can provide us with an Indian perspective on a potential Indo-Pacific century, and maybe also provide us with an outlook on the future of US-India relations. And last but certainly not least, to the very right, Professor Seokwoo Kim. He's a professor in the Department of International Relations at the University of Seoul and the current president of the Korean Association of International Studies. He has focused his work on international trade and inter-Korean relations, and can thus elegantly cover two of the most important current policy challenges at the same time. A small housekeeping remark from my side. The topic is huge, the panel is large. I will thus have to be a tiny bit ruthless when it comes to reining in remarks that exceed a certain time frame. So be brief and be quick. For just taking the temperature of this room, I would just like to, before we get into the conversation, ask you whether you think that we have entered the Asian century. Yes or no? Yes, show of hands. Have we entered the Asian century? No, we haven't entered the Asian century yet. And a lot of people are undecided. Okay, let's see if we can work this out later for the...
It would be interesting if you take the vote at the end.
We'll try that. We will try that. Let's see how convincing you can all be. So I have asked our panelists to think about whether they agree that we are on the verge of entering or have already entered the Asian century, and whether or not they think, whether they think we have so or don't think we have so, to name the factors why they do think so. So maybe we can start with Leonard over here.
Thank you very much. I will be brief. I don't think one can be a tiny bit ruthless. You either are ruthless or not, but I shall be brief. My preference is to not deploy the term Asian century. I find it hubristic. I find it representative of so much that many would like to escape from with respect to the rhetoric that came out of the United States for so many years, henceforth the American century or the British imperial century in the 19th. It's a language that I've always been reticent to use because of the sort of megalomaniacal connotations that it does imply. But having said that, and having made clear that it's not something that I am comfortable using, I do have a bit of an elective affinity to it nonetheless, because it's not representative, for once, of that which exists in what we may call the West or the global North, and it's representative of a part of the world that has not had the same degree of attention and appreciation and recognition for a variety of areas and concerns. So I won't use it myself, but I won't hold back others from deploying it.
And what would be the characteristics that you say are most relevant at the moment of this time shift that we see?
With respect to the notion of the Asian century, well, you know, it's clear that the United States and Europe have, for a variety of reasons that I'm sure we will come to, lost a considerable amount of political and economic and cultural and institutional significance. It's not to say that that can't be won back, but it's fair to say that at this point, and we live in a kind of interregnum moment, as Gramsci once put it, the old is not yet dead, the new is not yet born. We don't know precisely where we are headed, but I think we can feel confident in saying that America, to my mind, is in many ways a declining power. And so if we think, not that I necessarily appeal to this, but in some zero-sum fashion, I think the economic and strategic weight is tilted and intellectual towards Asia. And I think in many ways it's in part due to the diminution of such strength from America and Europe.
Thank you. Shada, what do you think? Have we entered the Asian century yet?
I think, yes, we have. Sonia, thank you for inviting me. I think, yes, we have. Economic power, definitely, Leonard, as you've said, is moving from the north to the south, from the west to the east. And all business leaders, you know, anyone worth their salt absolutely wants to be in Asia. That's the place to be. That's where money's to be made. But I don't think Asia has political power yet. And that's why there are tensions at the moment that we see, the geopolitical tensions. But I'll tell you the truth, Janka, I'm much more excited about two new concepts, new old concepts. The Eurasian moment, I think we're living through a revival of the whole idea of Eurasia. And added to that, I was just in Singapore and I talked to a very wise Chinese professor there. And he was talking about the Afro-Eurasia concept that is coming back. And I'll tell you why I think that's much more interesting. The Asia-Pacific is sort of us and them kind of a story, right? And like you, Leonard, I don't believe that that's what we should be talking about. We do that too much, zero-sum games, etc. I think Eurasia is more about collaborative effort. And as we speak here, the Asia-Europe meeting is taking place in Brussels, ASEM. And ASEM is, for me, a Eurasia meeting. Of course, the Europeans don't like to talk about Eurasia because it's been possessed, if you like, that term has been owned now by the Russians and to a large extent by the Chinese. So the Europeans talk about connectivity. connectivity rather than the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, it's all these, but those are nuances. The fact of the matter is that Eurasia is being created as we talk. And the Europeans are doing it, and we'll talk a little bit about that, through the trade deals, through connectivity, by increasing the security presence also in Asia. But there are, if you ask me, what are the challenges? I'll tell you, I think 3 or 4 challenges. First of all, very difficult for the Europeans to wean themselves off over-dependency on the United States. Europe still, despite Trump, looks west. And that's where the inclination, that's where the reflex is, let's look west, Transatlantic alliance and all that. But I think, gradually as economic power becomes more, there will be that. The other thing is, the second point would be China. China, if it is to be really a responsible, I would say, active, constructive player, has to rein in some of its more assertive, aggressive tendencies that we're seeing at the moment, and that is very important. The third thing I would say is Europe has to work out its relationship with Russia. We don't really have that. And I think if we can get over these sort of, if you like, tiny obstacles, people's mindsets change, we can get that. And finally, I'm really excited about, if we can work it out, an Afro-Eurasia. The Chinese are doing it through the BRI. There's no reason that Europeans can't be doing it, because that's where our demographic challenge comes from. That's where our migration challenge comes from. So yes, Asia century, but I think more a Eurasian moment.
With a lot of European in it.
A lot of Europe in it.
You can see the difference between working for a US institution at the moment and working for a European institution.
It's called Friends of Europe.
Lots more enthusiasm on the European side, which is very, very good. Jens, let me turn it to you.
Janka, thank you very much for the invitation, also to Sonia and her colleagues. I agree with the fact that it is an Asian, let's call it decades. I have certain reservations with regard to the term century. The last century started with Europe, but didn't end with Europe. So I would say it's a huge amount of time, a century, in today's not only politics, but also internet age. But it definitely is, if I look at, for example, the sheer scale and speed and location of innovation that is taking place. And that is mainly in Asia, in particular in China. If you just take examples like speech recognition, facial recognition, or the whole developments that we are witnessing since a number of years, and Asia there is miles ahead of how we understand it in Europe, of fintech startups. The whole banking sector or financial sector, how this is changing, and it is changing through and via Asia. That changes that the center of gravity of artificial intelligence. It's moving it away from the United States, much further towards Asian countries. Now, Shada mentioned that in this context, yes, we have to talk about China. And I think that there are 2 arguments here to be made. One, the Belt and Road Initiative is probably right now, using the term narrative, the most compelling narrative on offer. At the same time, it is ambitious. It has deep financial pockets. Many countries are signing up. International organizations are queuing up to sign up. But there's also growing skepticism towards the Belt and Road. Inside Asia, inside Europe. And most importantly, I wouldn't want to underestimate that, inside China itself. And we have to also consider these kind of reactions. Now, in my view, Sonia invited us this morning, as she said, to bring the global debate home. And I appreciated that metaphor. That includes to bring the Asian debate to Europe. How does it arrive in Europe? In particular, for example, in a city like Belgrade, a country like Serbia, because it is very visible if you move through Belgrade where China is and what China seeks to do, be it on a bridge, be it in a steel plant, be it in other forms of establishing and expanding a strategic partnership. So Asia, it's not only what is happening there, it is how Asia is coming here, in particular in the form of China and its Belt and Road initiatives. Here, because in the interest of being brief, just two small observations. With regard to Europe, I observe one, there's no unified response. It's increasingly difficult to have one, and I'm not sure anymore to what degree it can be established in the future. Maybe in selected policy areas, but overall I'm rather cautious to advocate we can still do this. The other is, there, in my view, with all the ambitions and the financing of the Belt and Road in Europe, there's also a danger of overreach, a danger of expectation management. What can all be done with the Belt and Road arriving in Serbia, in Macedonia, in Greece, in Hungary? And this expectation management is twofold: how China does it, but also how we do it in terms of, for example, the rules and regulations that we apply therefore. Thank you for the moment.
Thank you very much. And Sasha, how does it look from Moscow's perspective, considering that Moscow's always in the middle of being a European and an Asian power? Have you declared the Asian century in Moscow yet?
I think that in Moscow, the official stance would be that it's a multipolar world has arrived. I disagree that we are in the Asian century for two very simple reasons. A, by using the Orientalist Asia term, we lump everything together. We put there Japan, which is very much part of the West. We put in South Korea. We put in India and China, which have very different views of where they're going. So talking about the sheer numbers on GDP growth and stuff, correct, like the growth ratio is shifting eastwards, but I don't think that's a clear factor to define the century as an Asian for as obscure a term as Asian is. Point number two, if you look at the global governance and established order, I don't think that we are operating under an order which covers every single aspect, but we talk about some pillars like WTO, Bretton Woods institutions, market economy, and many others. Does Asia produce anything which, or China in particular, produce any rules which will be attractive to anybody, where China says, oh, that's a new rule set that we want to impose? We at Carnegie did a project on China as a rule maker or rule breaker. And the discovery was that China is actually pretty happy to live with oh so many aspects of the existing international order. It wants to cheat on the rules sometimes when it feels it's still so weak and cannot compete, playing by the rules, is very happy to play by the rules when it feels it is powerful enough. And then there are so many rules that are in the making, like in the cyber domain. So I don't think that this term helps us to explain anything. And I would agree with your initial thought that when we are talking about Asian century, we're basically talking that the Western-dominated century is over, and then we are in much more contested landscape where it's contests for ideas, rivalry between the great powers, and a lot of economic competition. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. And Harsh, I'm going to turn it to you.
I would take off from where Alex perhaps left or did not leave. I think just 2 points I want to make as my initial remarks. One is that it's going to be, Asia is going to be more important for the future of the global order simply because you can take up any issue today, whether it's global governance, whether it's economic globalization, whether it's climate change, whether it's how to reorder certain aspects of our functioning in terms of international environment. Asia is going to be part of those debates, sometimes from the center, sometimes from the periphery, but it is going to be part of that discussion. Unlike in the past when Europe set the rules and Asia was looking from outside. I think those days are gone. So in that sense, Asia's time has arrived. I would disagree with this argument that somehow Asia is now cogent enough of a factor that it can produce a decade, leave alone a century. I think Asia remains a very contested terrain. Most of our discussion, if you see the first three speakers, they were largely talking of China. China is not Asia. And that contestation that China's rise is producing has to be factored in. Asia can only make its presence felt, by if it manages to somehow bring China into the picture as a leader, as an institution builder, I think something that Alex pointed out, and as a concept that somehow aggregates the multiple dimensions that we see operating. None of that is happening. So structurally, if you look at what is happening in Asia, it's a diverse continent. China's rise has produced a proclivity amongst the regional states which are now looking for outside partners. So it's not as if China's rise has coalesced them into a single unit. They are now looking externally. So which is an interesting interplay of whether Europe should enter, whether Europe should play a balancing role somehow, what is happening in terms of China's rise, and I think BRI was brought in, and there Europe has an important role, and in terms of other conceptualizations. But what you're looking at, I think, sitting here in Europe is basically China and China's dominance, China's discourse. But I think those who sit in Asia would have a very different conception that China's rise is producing some of these challenges. So how do you counter them? So structurally there is a challenge, institutionally there is a challenge. Asia does not have an institutionalist architecture. Where do we look at? ASEAN is fraying at the edges. You have a situation where China itself does not allow other actors to enter the fray. So India and Japan are not allowed to be part of the UN Security Council because China does not like them. You have a situation where East Asia Forum, East Asia Summit becomes the dominant platform because their outsiders are allowed. So I think institutionally it's a complex terrain. Lastly, ideationally, I think again Alex mentioned that ideationally China is yet to produce something which pulls Asia together. I think aspects of that Chinese model, which is political authoritarianism and economic liberty, is attractive to some parts of the world. But I don't think they have the ability as an idea to sustain themselves over a long period of time. So I think sitting within Asia, it looks a very, very contested terrain. I doubt whether Asians themselves would call the coming decade or century an Asian century at this point.
Shada was speaking about the Eurasian century and her enthusiasm about that. Maybe that's the land domain of the conversation. Would you say that an Indo-Pacific century or an Indo-Pacific decade is something that's in the making, with the US supporting this, with India, with Japan, with Australia coming in? Will we draw the conversation about the center of gravity more towards the Indian Ocean that way? Is that in India's interest?
Well, but China does not support it. So Chinese don't like Indo-Pacific. So I think unless you have a buy-in from China, I don't think the concept has legs to stand, because ultimately it divides Asia. So again, if we are looking at this conversation as in terms of defining Asian century, even Indo-Pacific complicates. It's not as if Indo-Pacific is offering as an alternative. So I think that's the challenge for Asia at the moment.
Thank you so much. Professor Kim, I'd like to bring you in here.
I think that to judge whether it is the Asian century or not, I think we need to think about the strengths and weaknesses of the Asian countries as a whole. And the second thing is that whether we can treat Asia as a single unit, because there are huge variance among the Asian countries in terms of their economy and political situations and the religious diversity. There are so many things are going on among the Asian countries. Then one thing I need to emphasize is that even though there are some problems faced by the Asian countries, for example, diversity, and there are many political and security conflicts among the Asian countries, and the very high dependence of the Asian countries on the United States for economy and the security. But if we try to judge whether it is an Asian century or not, I think it will be the Asian century in terms of two things. One thing is that we can say that the volume of and the speed of the growth of the Asian countries, most of the Asian countries. And especially, I want to point out this. There is a very serious but very productive competition among the Asian countries themselves, among the China, India, and Japan, ASEAN, South Korea. Then it makes a very synergistic effect, positive effect on their development in the future. And also, second thing, I want to point out that what is the blocking factors to stop or slow down the process of the Asian growth? we can think about the two imaginary situations. There can be a very large-scale war among the countries within Asia or between Asia and the other parts of the world. And also, as you know, that China is still the non-democratic country. Then there can be a domestic revolution, those kind of things. Then unless those things happen, I think the process will continue for the time being, and it will make the Asian century.
Thank you so much. We have seen now a very diverse answer to this question, which is clear if you look at the panel and the diverseness that we see on the panel. One thing, though, that has kind of come up everywhere a little bit is the Belt and Road Initiative as something like as a thread that runs through this idea of the Asian century, that China's economic initiative and geopolitical and geoeconomic and geostrategic initiative is somehow shaping the world in a different way and has started something. Jens, I would like to bring you in on this one again. What is the most important aspect of it? You've touched on it a little bit, but from a European perspective, if you sit here, what's the challenge BRI poses and what should be the response?
I think the first challenge that BRI poses is do you reply as a country or as a continent? Do you reply as a multilateral financial institution? Take, for example, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London, of which China has become a member. Its shareholding is very small, not at all in relation to its economic weight. It wants to increase the shareholding. What does the EBRD do? On what kind of conditions?
What would you advise them if you were their advisor?
I would advise them to indeed increase their shareholding. It's a matter also of fairness, of recognizing what China brings to the table. But bringing to the table also works both ways. It means also recognizing a rules-based international organization. When, for example, China takes part in European tender processes, in the manner in which, for example, contracts are awarded. Here, the high-profile discussion about the Belgrade-Budapest railway connectivity, the manner in which this tender process had to be reopened in Budapest because it was not awarded on a rules-based contract. But China there is also learning because it reapplied and received the contract. It is not that it withdraws. The other issue that I would emphasize, and I'll keep my answer brief to that for the moment, is I think in Europe you have to understand, in my view, that China's Belt and Road Initiative has two characteristics. One is many of the projects already existed before the Belt and Road officially came into operation. Take, for example, China's investment in the port of Piraeus in Greece. Now it's labeled under Belt and Road, maritime connectivity. But China is in Greece since over 10 years. But the other aspect that I would also emphasize is that in many ways, the countries in Europe increasingly show that, or at least there are some countries, show that they are looking at China as an alternative. It starts with financing. Prime Minister Orban in Hungary has made it explicitly clear the amount of infrastructure investment that exists in the region is such that if you do not get it from Europe, we will be looking towards China. That is, I think, also a threat. And he's starting to exercise it. I think other countries are taking the cue from that. I'll leave it here for the moment.
Thank you, Shada. I'd like to bring you in here. Your Eurasian enthusiasm could end quite quickly if you cannot hold China accountable to a certain set of rules and standards that is dear to the Europeans. What would be your response to that? Do you think it's feasible, it's possible?
Absolutely, I think it is, because as Jens has said, China is learning very fast that being overly confident and overly assertive isn't working. This pushback across Asia, and Harsh has talked about it as well, across Asia, countries are saying enough is enough. I mean, take the case of Pakistan. CPEC, the economic corridor, Pakistan was considered to be in China's pocket, okay? all weather friends, all the rest of it. I would argue that BRI has actually made it very difficult for Pakistan and China to actually work together now, because it's inserted an element of real friction and acrimony because of the many things that Jens has talked about, lack of transparency. Pakistani business leaders feel they're not getting into the contracts that they were hoping for. Civil society in Pakistan is worried about corruption, about the environmental standards, about insecurity and the insurgency in Balochistan that's been revived. So there are many, many questions that are coming into it. And I think China has an interest, as does Europe, by the way, to work together on this, because there's no denying we need infrastructure, right? We need these connections, these bridges, these roads, these aviation, digital, whatever. We need those, and nobody else has the money. The ADB does not have the money. The Americans don't. We don't. China does, at least at the moment. So the idea is really you have to work. You have to compete and cooperate with a certain degree of self-confidence. And I would argue that the connectivity strategy that the EU has brought out, being EU is always, it's always jargon, it's always, a process, and people forget. But the essential element there is there's list of standards, norms that connectivity projects should abide by. And I think if we apply that as a rule book for projects, it will actually make the whole process easier. Of course, China has to come on board and recognize that, but I think the Chinese are learning very fast that they can't do it alone.
Leonard, can I bring you in here? Because there's one big country that has usually been on the forefront of fighting for norms and standards in the world, and it's kind of receding, and this is your home country. What does that mean for the rest of the world and the future of human rights and democracy when the US is not saying anything to the Belt and Road, or is putting out initiatives that are not quite something that can be an answer to it at the moment?
Human rights discourse is perhaps right now, globally, and the human rights movement too, I hasten to add, at a very, very low ebb. And there are reasons, as you suggest. I think after the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the capacity for the United States to play the role as a beacon for rights and justice issues, certainly as norms within the international system, has been greatly attenuated. But at the same time, the institutions, many of which have been in Europe, whether it's the European Union, the Council of Europe, International Criminal Court, these formidable institutions that have existed for the express purpose of working on the protection of individual rights, have been badly battered, Russia, to some extent, has played a role in that battering, but at the same time, the US and I would suggest China have also been complicit in the weakening of these vital institutions. I'm not sure how we get out of this mess.
That was been my question now. How do we get out of this mess?
That's an excellent thought. I think that it's going to take a generation. I think that international institutions, such as the ones that I mentioned, but not limited to them, are going to require fundamental repair. And that repair requires, in the first instance, a re-legitimization of these bodies. Now, to just take the International Criminal Court, it has lost, not that it necessarily ever fundamentally had, but it has lost considerable legitimacy because the first number of cases that it had prosecuted were all in Africa. That's changed. It's changed. But there's still huge issues, and it's going to take a while. The system of global governance that we had thought a couple of decades ago was going to lead us, we'll hold who that us is for a moment, into some sort of radiant future. Well, that's not happening. And so I hope that there can be enough actors globally, both states and non-governmental actors, who would be committed to, in some ways, repairing and reimagining that system of global governance. But it'll take a generation. It's not going to happen between administrations in countries. It's going to be a while.
Sasha, China has put itself on the forefront of saying it defends the multilateral international order. It's actually a defender of the institutions that are out there. You have written quite a bit about China-Russia relations over the past couple of years, and if one follows your reading in recent months and maybe over the last year, you've become more certain that there is something there. A colleague of mine would say there's a there between Russia and China. What is it that is emerging in this constellation, and what is the effect that it will have on international order?
I think if you would compare Geopolitics to a dating app like Tinder, I think that China and Russia have all the natural reasons to swipe each other in the same direction. And the reason for that are they share a border that is the largest continental border. They have invested a lot during the confrontation time after Sino-Soviet split. And their security priorities now lie elsewhere. Like China is obsessed with Taiwan, with Daklam Plateau, with South China Sea, Seokwoo, whereas Russia is obsessed with NATO, Ukraine, Syria. And a border between two nuclear powers needs to be stable. They settled the territorial dispute, and now that's the bottom line. Like, they not necessarily are with each other on every single issue, but they can never afford themselves to go back to confrontation because it's too costly. Number two, it's the economy. And if you look at Russia's trade with Europe and with China, it's absolutely similar because it's Russia's commodities in exchange for technology, basically, and machinery. It's just the volumes that are different because Russia was putting all the eggs in Europe basket. And point number three, I'm getting to your question, is the political nature of the two systems. Russia is sovereign democracy or democracy by constitution. If you read Chinese constitution, it's socialist democracy with Chinese characteristics. Neither is a democracy. Both are different degrees of authoritarian regimes, a party state, a more centralized, leader-focused monarchy in Russia, which has a decorum of democracy. But they have a lot of overlaps in terms that the state definitely is at the forefront and it trumps the society. And there is a lot of, mutual practices that they want to share. Chinese draconian NGO law has been copycatted from the Russian law. Russians are looking very carefully into the Golden Shield project, social credit system, and many other digital dictatorship tools that China is employing. So there is a lot of overlap. Whether these countries want to export and push for the way the US was exporting democracy and supporting freedom, whether these countries want the rest of the world be non-democratic, I don't think so. But for the existing dictatorships, some of these tools are really appealing because you look at China, its economy is booming. They have really sophisticated environment for innovation, and at the same time, they remain a pretty successful dictatorship. Some countries want to imitate that, and if China is ready to provide them with digital tools, like social credit system and surveillance state, they would be happy to import that.
At this point, I would like to bring in Professor Kim, because on two aspects, the question of North Korea becomes interesting in this conversation. One is the question of the economy. China, Russia, and South Korea would be the biggest benefactors of a peaceful solution of the Korean crisis and of potential connectivity throughout the Korean peninsula. And the other aspect is what kind of a future could the North Korean regime envisage for itself when it looks at what is happening in China? Is that a role model, a transition model, something that could happen? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
It will be a long process for the denuclearization of North Korea and the eventual prosperity and the peace on the Korean peninsula. But if it is realized, as you told us, the biggest beneficiaries will be South Korea, China, and Russia, maybe Japan too. But yet, there have been lots of the policies pursued by the neighboring countries in Asia, in East Asia. For example, the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative, which was not very directly connected to the South Korea because of the North Korea was a kind of island country. They are blocking the linkage between the China and the South Korea. And also there was the Russian Eastern policy, and the Indian Eastern policy too, and there was the Japanese, the Indo-Pacific strategy. Then to realize all those the policy proposals together to make a more economic, social development in the region, I think denuclearization of the North Korea is necessary, and also the prosperity and the peace on the Korean Peninsula is also necessary. There are lots of discussions on the Korean Peninsula, which model North Korea will follow the path. Chinese or Vietnamese, I don't know. But yeah, we think that the Chinese situation is totally different from North Korean situation. Then we anticipate that if it is liberalized and they adopt an open policy toward the international society, it will follow the path of Vietnam in maintaining the socialist system and the part of the opening system.
Thank you. Harsh, I would like to bring you in here, and as you can see, we're kind of hopping all over the Asian region. But if you listen to the previous speakers, India has always pursued a policy of equidistance, of non-alignment. A provocative question maybe, but how long can you keep this up? Is it time for India to choose sides to some degree? Does it still have the liberty of not having an alliance to lean on to?
Well, I think if you look at not the rhetoric, but the actual policy, the policy direction is very clear. I think from where India was, say, in 1998, with respect to its relations with the US, to where it is today, where it is signing one foundational agreement after another, foundational agreements where the militaries can cooperate between, there's greater interoperability between the militaries of India and the US. It's a remarkable distance. I mean, I think sections of the Indian policymakers would continue to claim that equidistance is an option, non-alignment is something that in theory we would like to follow, but in reality the ground is shifting from beneath the Indian feet, partly because China is a big factor in our strategic relations. And if you look around India and the way China is shaping India's strategic profile in the region, it's very clear that unless India manages to have some very strong partnerships, it won't be able to manage China's rise. So while the issue is that it's not about an open confrontation with the Chinese, but realism demands that you have friends. India will, I don't think, will enter into an alliance framework with any country, but short of alliance, everything is possible. So you can be partners, and I think that is what is happening. If you look at what has happened in the last few years in terms of where the military partnerships are happening, where military training is happening, even including the French, for example. India signed a logistics-based agreement with the French very recently. So in that sense, the whole argument that used to exist in the past of being shy in terms of having military engagements with certain countries, especially in the West, that argument is no longer relevant because the ground realities have changed significantly and altered significantly. But I think the ambition to have, because India sees itself as one of the poles in the system, therefore there is an ambition to have relations with other major powers. So therefore India would not give up its relations with Russia because Americans wanted to. So there is a sanctions regime in operation, but India has just signed a very big deal with the Russians on defense equipment. And I think similarly with China, it would like a relationship that allows us to have a conversation with the Chinese despite the differences. So I think that sort of matrix continues to be in place. But if you look at what is happening in reality, you were talking of Indo-Pacific earlier, I think that is something that India has taken a step. In 2007, there was an idea of Quad that came into being. So the idea of Quad being that 4 countries in the region, major naval powers like Japan, America, Australia and India should come together and frame a maritime response. In 2007, when it was floated the first time, India and Australia both rejected it because they thought that it would antagonize China unnecessarily. In 2017, it came back and India and Australia both signed on to
As
it.
it was necessarily to
Yes.
antagonize China all of a sudden.
So I think that that shift has happened, and that shift has happened partly because I think the big elephant in the room, being the China factor, is clearly dominating every country's strategic thinking, including India's.
And now the classical European question will be, do you see a role for Europe in this?
Well, I think India sees a role for Europe, and I think especially now, because there was a lot of conversation about BRI earlier. And I think one of the things that BRI is generating is a lot of pushback and a lot of rethink. Now, India was one of the only country, perhaps, which openly, explicitly opposed BRI. Part of the reason was that it passed through a territory which India claims to be its own territory and Pakistan claims to be its territory, and therefore India said that if it's a disputed territory, then you really can't have a corridor through the territory. But I think India also made certain points about transparency, about how it is being funded, about what is the role of regional stakeholders from within the countries going to be, about capacity building, etc., which India had raised last year in May 2017 when this was the first outlined. Today, if you look at the statements of every major power in the West, these phrases are recurring now. I think that is one can say that is something that the rest of the world is now borrowing from India's playbook, that look, if you want to challenge China on BRI, you have to have a normative frame of reference. And I think India is also doing something which is starting proposing its own initiatives. So along with Japan, there is an Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which is being planned, which is a similar kind of a project about connectivity. But the difference there is that unlike the top-down approach of BRI, in the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, the argument is that it's going to be bottom-up. It's going to be about African states. They will decide what kind of connectivity, what kind of infrastructure they want, and it will be about capacity building. So the frame is turned upside down. And I think that in some ways is a counter to BRI, although Japanese don't like to call it that. But it is clearly a reference to what China is doing with BRI, and therefore, with your earlier point that whether it's going to be an Asian century or not, you can clearly see that even on connectivity, you are starting to see the differences from Malaysia, Sri Lanka, now Pakistan. Almost every country is questioning BRI. Similarly, there is an alternative being put in place by other regional powers who hope to be a counter to BRI. So I think even in Asia, there's a lot of churn going on, and China's BRI is not the only game in town.
I would like to get the audience in quickly, so think about questions already that you may have, but maybe one last round here on the big elephant in the room that might be the trade conflict between the US and China. Now, I think this is not the key topic of our conversation, but it stands as a symptom of something that is going on, and that's the question of can and will you contain China to remain a certain amount of leadership in the US or in Europe? Leonard, the US has taken a step forward to take on China head on, basically saying, the speech that Vice President Pence gave on interference, on potential actions that the Chinese are taking to destroy the democratic system and distort elections. This is quite something, and this is something that also, where a China-Russia conversation comes into the U.S. domestic discourse, with both parties being kind of seeing one as the other evil. Where does this lead us, and is it a good thing that someone is taking on China at the moment?
To respond to the last two questions, it's a terrible thing, and it leads us to an abyss. But having said that, I think this is the policy of Trump, Pence, and Bolton. I don't even think of this as a U.S. foreign policy, because the U.S. doesn't have a coherent foreign policy, but it's a very individualist, idiosyncratic foreign policy derived from Trump, very much augmented by John Bolton, the National Security Advisor. That's about unilateralism in a world that's not unilateral, American exceptionalism in a world where America is not exceptional, and an isolationism in a world that can't be. You can't have so-called great powers be isolationist. So it's a total riddle wrapped inside an enigma of a puzzle, of a sham, of a farce, I can keep going with the metaphors. It's a miserable state of affairs, and it will not get us to a point in relations with China, with Russia, that make any sense. It will only be baneful for all parties involved. And I'm not speaking from some, Economist magazine free trade position, but I'm trying to speak much more commonsensically. I think it's a very dangerous moment, and I hope that this moment will itself expire within the next couple of years.
Shada, I would like to ask you the question as well, whether Europe will eventually have to choose sides, because the conversation that we're having that's going on in editorials at the moment is the question of economic decoupling, the question of whether US and China will no longer work with each other, but Europe's kind of caught in the middle there. Do you think that we still have a choice?
I think talk of containing China is so 20th century, actually, 19th century. I think binary choices in today's 21st century are also not the choice that exists, because we are working in coalitions, we compete, we cooperate. In the case of China, let's be very frank. The quick rise of China
I was waiting for you to say, let's be very frank. Very good.
Frankly speaking, it has absolutely, I think, unnerved the entire world community. We didn't expect it to happen so fast. And China, for Europe and America, has gone from being a junior partner that you could lecture and hector and give advice to an equal partner, which plays by the rules sometimes and does not play by the rules other times. And I agree with Alex that, they are not actually seeking to impose new rules, except through the BRI, because be careful, guys, because when you are buying into the Belt and Road, the arbitration procedures, the dispute settlement procedures that China is putting up, the legal, accountability, do in many ways create a parallel WTO-like structure. So let's be careful about that. But in Europe's case, when you look at the BRI, Janka, there is concern not just about the transparency or lack of, but also European investments Chinese investments coming in. And there is concern that they're coming into very strategic assets, in case of Germany, into some very high-tech companies. So you have also the question of reciprocity. Can European companies invest the same way in China as the Chinese companies do in Europe? No, not really. So reciprocity, screening of investments. So when we look at China, we're seeing a competitor, but we're not seeing what Trump is seeing as an enemy. Right? Competition is good. Competition drives you forward. But we don't, and we shouldn't see China as an enemy, because we can work together on climate change. Who are you going to work with? Who are you going to talk to? Is it the Americans? No. When you talk about WTO reform, a lot of the conversation has to be about the dispute settlement and the arbitration procedures. America has said it doesn't want to appoint new judges. So you're condemning WTO to death. What about the JCPOA, Iran, the Iran nuclear deal that we Europeans have worked for with the Chinese and the Russians for? America's withdrawing from it. Do we allow Iran then to, become once again in a very difficult situation in terms of sanctions and the rest of it? So Europe does need to work with Asia, whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's Japan or Korea. There are no alternatives. And there, I think, is where we, as Europeans, will diverge from the Americans at some point. We will have to look after our own interests and defend our own values.
As much as Jens is nodding, I think he wants to come in here.
Yeah,
on this point.
sure.
I couldn't agree more with what Shada has just said. I really also am not convinced that it's about containing. China can't be contained anyway. That's the wrong point of departure. It's about engaging China. And it works both ways. Just look at how this is taking place in the WTO. The EU, the US, and Japan have jointly filed a complaint at the WTO against China regarding mandatory joint venture investments. But turn that around also. Beijing, together with Tokyo and with Brussels, they are challenging the US in the WTO regarding tariffs on aluminium and steel. That's engagement, but it works then both ways. two concerns that I have, and Shada, you mentioned one point that really has to be borne in mind from a European perspective. The legal and financial complexity that countries, companies, banks are getting themselves into when signing contracts with China in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative is a huge challenge. You mentioned arbitration. The legal resolution of any conflict resides today in Beijing, not in Europe. That's a complete shift of legal history, of legal precedent in the future, let alone from the fact that there are many people who will have to learn not only Chinese, but also Chinese law in the future.
Plus, there is no independent jurisdiction in the country.
And we have serious doubts about the independence of the jurisdiction. Last point. Another concern that I have about the Belt and Road, we often look at it from the point of view of infrastructure. There's also another form of Belt and Road in which I would call soft power. And that is, for example, also here in this country, the manner in which Confucius institutes are being arranged across the region of Southeastern Europe and in other parts of Europe.
Across Central Asia, too.
Across Central Asia, in Western Europe. But I'm concerned there about three issues. To what degree, for example, do you talk about human rights in these institutes? To what degree do you talk about international legislation of arbitration courts in the South China Sea, or the three Ts, meaning Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen? This is where
And
I
add
am.
Xinjiang to that, maybe
Excuse
as
me?
well. And add Xinjiang to that as well.
Xinjiang to that. This is where I see kind of a creeping preemptive obedience sometimes setting in among European countries, or what Harsh said, not to antagonize China.
Sasha, we have talked in the preparation of this panel a little bit about how we can provoke you all to think a little less linear and more creative about what's going on. So I've asked you to borrow a little bit from the animal world and think about black swans and gray rhinos out there. So what is out there that's there and that we don't see and don't realize as being a huge danger to an established order? And what's there that are the black swan events that we don't even know that are out there yet, and we can only speculate about what could come across as something like that? Do you have something in your mind, like a black swan or a gray rhino, that you can see that you would warn us now and start engage people in thinking about the situation that we face a little more creatively?
The little blue bird that is on Trump's Twitter is not a black swan, but it's probably more powerful and more dangerous. But I think that the whole context which the development of U.S. domestic system presents is a pretty challenging. And I think that this experiment with very unknown results, as much as I wish that the U.S. will reinvent itself as it has done internal, I don't know what's going to happen this time, because we are seeing a wild experiment of democracy in a federalist context set against capitalist economy and the technological drive and disruption, with polarization of the society, polarization of wealth, and the educational opportunities provided by that, tearing the society apart, set against the political framework where one person is still one vote, and it's disproportional and obsolete federalist system to level the states up a little bit. That's happening in the world still, preeminent power. I think that's what kind of political leadership it will produce. Is Trump an aberration caused by almighty Putin hacking into DNC? Or is it more norm, and we're going to see more and more populist politicians come into the US, because that's the nature of politics in this country, and also with the West. So I think that in the West you have social safety net, which can help to mitigate those polarization in society. That's point number one. What kind of political decision that's going to produce? And B, cyber was never mentioned, but I think that's the big thing, right?
So what's the big thing about cyber?
Look, we're talking about the established order, we don't have any rules in this sphere. Like, is it legit to take down New York Stock Exchange if the U.S. retaliates against Russia and imposes some sanctions? How do we engage in this? Like, I think that the world went through Convention on Chemical Weapons and different aspects of military combat. Now the military domain moves so much into cyber world, where there are basically no rules along the road, and there is so much civilian infrastructure. It's so intertwined. The attribution, like everybody who knows this world knows how complex that is. So that's probably something which worries me a lot and should worry everybody else.
Harsh, what is your greatest worry, the black swan or the gray rhino out there?
Well, I think a lot of it is something that I think we have all touched upon. A part of it is something that we have touched upon, which is that I think we are passing through this interesting phase. Some may call it very, very difficult or dangerous, where I think in democracies, at the one hand, you have people's expectations which are rising very fast. And I think the established political order is somehow unable to do justice to them. And on the other, you have this churn which is pushing people back towards questioning some of the basic values that we thought would endure. And I think some of us in Asia, which used to look at Europe and say, oh, this is the haven of certain kinds of values. Now those values are being challenged, right and center. Much as we would like to blame Mr. Trump for all the ills in the world, he's a manifestation of something more fundamental that is happening. And I think for that, a lot of the blame has to go to the established political order by not asking certain kinds of questions, by not debating some of the issues that perhaps remain central to a large part of this population. And I think those discussions, unless they happen, will have the ability to somehow take away from this. Otherwise, I think we are living in a world where some of these problems will continue to be, we will continue to press them under the carpet. But and when they erupt, they'll erupt in the form of Mr. Trump. And I think that challenges I think a democracy like India as well. We are a democracy, and we are a very proud democracy, young democracy. But I think as a democracy, we have always looked to the West, saying, look, democratic values and how institutions are managed there. But if the West starts questioning those basic values, it has an effect across the world. And I think that's why Asia, where you have multiple systems of governance operating at the same time, will find it very difficult to engage. And I think, therefore, there has been always a challenge that, for a very long time, if you look at Western discourse, despite the fact that West had this liberal democratic core, the relationship with China was privileged. Very few in the West, till a few years back, were willing to question China fundamentally. So if you look at Europeans, for example, EU, Brussels for the last decade and a half had been engaging China very, very substantively while ignoring India. Now, the point here is not that India should not, that China should not have been engaged with. The problem here is
that the other shouldn't have been ignored.
India as a democracy was ignored and somehow marginalized. And I think that is also reflective of some of the larger issues that we contest in terms of values and norms.
Shada wants to come in here real quickly, and then we'll open it up to you.
I don't believe that India has been ignored by the European Union. It really hasn't. No, but it takes two to tango. And I have watched, I've been a journalist on this issue before I became a think tanker. I have watched the Europeans go out of their way to engage with India and being told, no, we'd rather engage with Germany, Britain, France. You guys have no power. We want security. You can't bring us any security. So I would just say now, of course, India has woken up to Europe. India has woken up, so now we can have an adult conversation. But seriously, that I think is unfair.
Professor Kim wants to come in, and then I'll get to you.
I just want to
You can already raise your hands, and I can see where the questions are.
I just want to say one thing about the trade war between the United States and China. I think I want to ask this question to the people here. A country with the highly developed technologies and highly developed economy, with the position of the lots of resources, if that country has had the trade deficits for decades, is it natural then we need to try to ask the question. If that country faces those kind of problems, I think that country might try to have a solution domestically or foreign. The domestically, higher level of consumption by American people, maybe. And the foreign, maybe protection from other countries. Then in taking a Indo-Pacific strategy, the meaning of, we need to think about the meaning of free and open. Free means passage of the naval route, connecting the Asia and Middle East and Europe. What is open? Open your market, right? To China, right? And final thing is that the openness means maybe democratization. Then we need to think about it.
Thank you. I would like to open it up to all of you for questions that you may have. There's 2, 3 over here. Let's take two, three together. We'll start over here.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Strachnia. I work at the European Policy Center. I'd like to, if I may, localize the Asian century to the Western Balkans. And I have a question for Mr. Bastian. I think you published an EBRD report last year. So my question is, have you noticed any changes since then? It's been a year. And what do you expect to happen in the following years? As we've seen, Brussels has been, at least that's how it seems to me, more and more anxious about China's presence. But I've done my own research about it, and in practice, it doesn't really seem that China is economically and politically as present as some would like to wish. So, thank you.
Thank you. The next question was up front here as well.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm Viktor Krasilchikov, Russian citizen, but now I live and work in Poland, the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies in Warsaw. Since I am one of few scholars who compared the experience of Latin American and East Asian development, and I have a question concerning topic of our discussion today about the future of China and some other East Asian countries. As we know very well, these countries have been very successful in education. And I would like to use the word learning, but what do you think about their successes in studying? In my opinion, it's necessary to distinguish learning and studying from each other.
How do you mean that? Just concretely.
And what do you think about the prospect of Asia, including China, in promotion of innovations, taking into account the so-called cognitive conservatism rooted in Confucian tradition?
Okay, thank you. No, not to me, I have one. Thanks. Let's take one more question. Over here.
Thank you. My name is Adam. I'm a student of the third year of the Faculty of Security Studies, University of Belgrade. I have a question for Mr. Alexander. You mentioned that, you stated that Russia and China are natural allies, geopolitical allies. But I have my concerns, and I would like to hear your thoughts about inequality between those two allies, because China has far greater population, economy cannot really match, and it is arguable that their military is now on the same level or more capable than Russia's, if not demonstrated, and technology gap is now shortening. That was really the biggest trade that Russia could offer. So I know that they were going to be allies due to Central Asia and some other common interests, but will they be equal partners? Can they be really equal partners if one of them is superior in every single sphere of politics? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll do a second round in a minute. Maybe we'll start with Jens for the time being for the question of Chinese investments in the Western Balkans. How significant is it really, and are we seeing any changes here?
Within a year, a lot can happen. Let me give you some examples of that. First of all, with regard to the EBRD vis-à-vis China interaction. Since then, the EBRD has become active in the Silk Road Fund as a contributing member. It is also active together with China and many other think tanks in an umbrella think tank called SILKS. And the EBRD, for example, here the office in Belgrade itself is awarding certain small-scale contracts to Chinese companies in areas where it is active. More generally, looking across Europe, you have a Brussels-led initiative and a bilateral-led initiative from France and Germany regarding the whole issue of investment screening. I won't go into details about it, but much is regarding to what degree is it a Brussels-led or still a national member state-led initiative. But it's on the agenda and it will not go away. The 16+1 is enlarging. Recently in Greece, the Prime Minister Tsipras has officially for the first time in Brussels mentioned that he may possibly formally apply for membership and hence turning it into a 17+1. Croatia has awarded twice in a row now for the co-financed project by the EU a contract to a Chinese consortium to build a bridge between Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina to link Croatian certain islets better. It's the first time that a co-financed project, and it's quite a lot of money, is actually being won by Chinese. And, for example, Manchester City Airport has entered into a consortium with a Chinese company to bid for a concession license in the Sofia airport just a few days ago. Hence you can see how, and I won't use the term Belt and Road, but how Chinese activities, they are expanding in volume, in sectors, and in terms of the partners with whom you do business in Europe.
And maybe one sentence on
Please.
the question of whether this is investment or whether this is loans, and whether
Very
for
good.
countries
Okay.
like Serbia, it
Yes.
means the being indebted to China could preclude the possibility of becoming an EU member eventually.
I don't think that it will stand in the way. Nevertheless, it is an issue to be discussed, to have on the agenda. You are absolutely right to distinguish between investment-led Chinese activities, and Serbia is one of the few countries where you can actually speak, apart from Greece, in this region of Southeastern Europe, about equity investment from China in a specific sector, in this case here, in the steel sector. Otherwise, yes, the overriding focus is on bank-led lending, and in particular policy banks from China, with various consequences which sometimes are highlighted under the term of a possible debt trap. I may go into that in a later part of the conversation.
Shada, you wanted to jump in here, and then we...
Quickly, I mean, one of the things, sorry about that, one of the things is this geopolitical and geo-economic symbolism of China in the Western Balkans or Central and Eastern European countries. The European Union has always prided itself on its normative power and the fact that its attraction will somehow bring human rights and rule of law, democracy to its neighborhood. Now, if China is coming with an, as you said, alternative model, then that power of transformation is diminished. So I think part of it is, of course, fears of debt and all the things you've talked about, Jens, but basically it's also a geopolitical challenge to a European Union that has ruled, in a sense, the neighborhood. Of course, Russia's there too, I'm not denying that. But that, I think, is something that is a psychological, a mindset challenge to the EU today.
And Sasha, the question to you about China and Russia as the natural allies, and maybe also a question of because you are a China scholar as well, the question that was raised about the difference between learning and studying and the promotion, the potential to promote innovation.
I think that I'm pretty bullish on Chinese ability to promote innovation in general terms. They've been Confucian civilization, whatever, at the time when they were making a lot of great discoveries. And that didn't prevent them to make these discoveries. I'm slightly worried about now the ideological campaign that Xi Jinping imposes to limit foreign influence. That can be super damaging long term. But before that, I don't think that their political setup has prevented them to become very innovative and smart. Like the US is in a better shape because it can rely on a pool of global talent. Anybody can immigrate to the US and become US citizen and contribute to that. Like Chinese have to rely on their own population and on Huaqiao, but I think that so far they've been doing very good. If you probably remember the op-ed in Washington Post when the American team won this school children math competition, that, oh, this is because of American democracy, and if China cannot even win this, well, I went to check back the track record since this competition exists over the last 20 years. Net winner last year, the year before, and so far is China. China is simply the best, and if you look at the members of the American team, these are Xu, these are Chu, these are all ethnic Chinese, and part of them Chinese immigrants. So I think that Chinese, and that's the part of the global competition, which is actually very beneficial. Like the most constructive and engaging part of the Cold War competition were sports and the space race between Soviet Union. And so this competition between universities, it's great. China says we have 5,000 years of history, we have Confucius and blah, 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 and that's why the best universities will be Beida, Tsinghua, of course, University of Hangzhou, like Zhejiang Daxue, and others. And the Americans say no, because of the can-do spirit, the openness of the American society is always going to be Harvard, Yale. Let's compete. That's a good part of this competition. So I'm pretty bullish on China. Russia, China. I didn't say that they are allies. I say that they can have a very good Tinder date. But having a good Tinder date doesn't mean that you are entering into marriage. On a more serious note, I think Harsh summed it up very well. Like in 21st century, these countries don't enter alliances which are Warsaw Pact or NATO-like. This is really rudiment of the past, because in the multipolar world, these big powers want to have more flexibility and want to cooperate and compete. Think about Russia and China providing each other type of Article 5 security guarantees. Is something gone wrong on the Klam Plateau? Russia has to declare war to India. If something goes wrong in South China Sea, Russia has declared war to Vietnam, one of its major ASEAN partners. If Russian and Israeli planes crash over skies in Syria and Russia into military confrontation with Israel or the US, China has to declare war on the US. Doesn't make sense. So both of these countries don't want to give each other these type of security assurances. That doesn't mean, however, that their cooperation in the military domain doesn't get deeper. I can give you one example, like military arms trade is a good one, but then last year when it looks like the Chinese have cracked the system that the CIA was communicating with its agents in China and has penetrated the network and caught a lot of agents, the Chinese intelligence services has shared the codes and the technology with the Russians the very same year. So that shows you the degree which two countries go in cooperation, very sensitive matters, because they're obsessed with the US. On equality, I think that's a very Russian question. That's a super Russian question. The real Russian question is whether do you respect me? The asymmetry is there, and the asymmetry is growing. And the Russians know that, and that causes a lot of unease. But looking in pragmatic terms, if you're searching for symmetry between partners and allies, where is symmetry between Great Britain and the US? Where is symmetry between Germany and the US? It doesn't prevent them from cooperating. If China would be obsessed about symmetry in partnering with the US when the Kissinger moment came and China opened up, like, oh, will the Americans treat me as an equal? Will they respect 5,000 years of my history? Because they're such a behemoth, they're such a large economy, such a powerful military, whereas we are a country in tatters just after the Cultural Revolution. Oh no, we shouldn't enter into this partnership. I think Chinese were very smart and pragmatic, saying, okay, where does this partnership get us? And I think that's exactly where it's going right now, the debate where it's going in Russia. Like, do we have alternatives? Being sanctioned by the US, like there is no way back because of CATSA and stuff. So literally there is no other way to attract foreign investment to get more technology and loans, particularly for those companies that are sanctioned or close to Putin, as to turn to China. Last point on this, you know that Chinese are very good in massage, and Russians have a very big ego. Chinese are brilliant in massaging the Russian ego. They will never, and talking about values, they will never come to Russia and say, what about gay rights in Chechnya? How is Ramzan Kadyrov treating those gays? Right? How about freedom of speech? There are a lot of natural overlaps, and I think that Chinese will never ever interfere into Russian domestic affairs in, but at least public way, like criticizing Russia. And that's what makes Russia oh so happy. Like in a corner, in a quiet room where they have negotiations on the price for oil, Chinese can be very rude and tough and pushing Russians into the corner. But once they go into the public, and Russians are super status conscious in the public eyes, Chinese will be saying, Russia is an equal partner, Russia is oh so important that that's why the Chinese leader will always go on his maiden trip abroad to Russia. And that's, I think, what Russians value. So they understand the power balance and the shift, but I think that they appreciate the Chinese, massaging their ego. Everybody loves a good massage.
As Sasha's given us an input in the Russian soul, this has prompted Leonard to ask a question.
I'm just wondering, Sasha, in the Russian press over the last few weeks, has there been anything written about what we have learned in the other press about what's happening in Xinjiang with respect to the camps?
There was one big publication on Medusa, and the first outlet to publish something on Xinjiang in Russia was Carnegie.ru.
This is not a setup.
Yeah, this is not a setup. So we had a big analytical piece, and then Medusa published a piece which was very widely read both in Russia and in the Stans, particularly in Kazakhstan, which has a lot of trouble now with China over Xinjiang issue. But the rest is silent, and that's also very interesting. Ramzan Kadyrov, the notorious leader of Chechnya, staged a mass rally over Rohingya, over Myanmar. And that was very widely publicized, so he pretended to be defender of rights of Muslims. Right now in China, we have 1 million people allegedly sent to concentration camp, definitely unwillingly, and China calls them re-education camp, whatever. It's absolute silence in state-controlled media in Russia.
I will get to you in just a minute, but Jens wants to get in and Professor Kim as well. So just really briefly, Jens and Professor Kim.
Two examples of how China and Russia are cooperating, and often we underestimate the depth of that cooperation. China is helping Russia building deep water ports in Siberia. China has increasingly become, over the course of the past years, one of the most important financial lenders to Russia. This is on-the-ground practical assistance which substantiates, Sasha, what you have just said, that you don't necessarily have to portray that very much outside, but you respect both countries' needs in very practical terms.
Professor Kim.
I just want to add one thing about the Confucius tradition and culture. That is closely related to the hardworking, and they're going together, the relationship. And also, the common things shared by the East Asian countries is education and studying. For example, in Korea, 75% of the high school graduates go to university. It means that they learn something, very rapidly changing technologies very rapidly. And other two things are the kind of a special treatment during the development process, and also the very stable political system in the region.
Thank you very much. We go to a second quick round of questions. We have 1, 2, any more? 3, this is your last chance. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Hi. Working? Okay. Hi. My name is Milan Radonic. It's a really beautiful discussion. I've got
State your affiliation really quick.
Milan Radonic, PhD student coming from engineering background. I've got questions for Shada and Mr. Jens. On a positive page, looking for the Chinese long-term planning, can we find comfort in the geopolitical interpretation of everything, seeing that with Deng Xiaoping and later on Hu Jintao, they all presented the outline that the economic development is, that the peace is the prerequisite for their economic development. So if we cannot choose whose economic development it'll be, at least it'll be peace as the prerequisite, which is a key problem in today's society. And for Mr. Bastian, concerning Europe, your EBRD report was very, very substantial and very, very good. Does the does Europe, as the European market, has a shield in its hands called quality in terms of mega projects, referring to roads, ports, and similar projects that China has been developing in Latin America and Africa? Okay, thank you.
Please, over here.
Hi, I wanted to, Sonia Stojanovic Gajic, Belgrade Center for Security Policy. I wanted to ask the question about soft power. If you could unpack it maybe in two ways. One, is it about Beijing consensus, so no official conditionality as with the West, more political? Or you're also speaking about cultural influence, and is there, Confucius institutes and money enough for China to promote, or we will have different, who in Asia is actually having the biggest power to export cultural models? Bollywood, manga, or Korean pop, or?
Thank you. And the last question here. If there's no one over here, because I was afraid to fall off the cliff, so I didn't turn around too much.
Thank you. My name is Nina Jovanovic, and I'm from the Faculty of Security Studies in Belgrade. And I have a very simple question for any of you, if you're willing to answer, because you're all from different perspectives. And I was wondering which one is the biggest geopolitical challenge that China is facing at the moment, since all of you have been more or less been talking about the challenges that China has been posing to other countries. So what is the challenge that China is facing at the moment?
That's a very easy question, thank you. Yes. One last question over here. In the front, the first row.
Hi, Jelena Žarković, Belgrade University professor. I wanted to ask the same question regarding the soft power, but in fact it's related to Joseph Nye's book, Is the American Century Over? So I was recalling that when we began this discussion. So can you answer that? What do you think? So nobody mentioned, in fact, that.
Okay, thank you. I think we should give every speaker the chance to respond, and I will go in reverse order and start with Professor Kim.
All right. I want to say two things. Think about the soft power not backed by hard power. Then I think that the soft power goes hand in hand with the hard power. Without hard power, soft power is nothing, I think. And the second thing I want to say that in competition and in changing environments in the international society, we are experiencing a so-called soft balancing rather than hard balancing. Until the 1990s, there was a hard balance between the Soviet Union and the United States. They compete each other in most of the issues, but nowadays is totally different. In some issue areas, they cooperate each other. In some other areas, they compete each other. Then we are experiencing the new era, actually. Then it's different from the past.
Thank you. Harsh.
Well, I think the soft power question is very interesting because if I can put a mark to 2006, there was a big literature coming out saying, look at these wonderful Chinese, their soft power is winning over Asia. And everyone is falling over backwards to please the Chinese, how they are funding these institutes, how they are looking, how many, while Americans wield a big stake, Chinese are doing it softly, and everyone is fine. And then came the South China Sea dispute. So from 2006 to 2018, it's a different story. No one actually is buying the Chinese soft power narrative anymore, at least in Asia. So therefore, I think soft power and how it is related to the larger strategic picture is, I think, as the professor here mentioned, has a certain link. On its own, it does stand certain chance, but I think in Asia at the moment, China is not the country whose soft power is winning, and that also poses certain problems to the bigger question of Asian century. That also, I think, tells you another story, which is that still, I think, most of the countries in the region, most of the youngsters in the region dream of America. It's still very popular. There is still a palpable drive that most of our youngsters want to go to the West to study. I would say West. So I think Britain, America, Germany, France still remain the countries where a lot of our youngsters want to go and study. And that impact that these youngsters who go and study in these countries and when they come back, that impact that it has is very, very significant. And I think that has to be fundamentally evaluated when we are discussing what will happen 2 decades down the road. And I think there I would give you a very good example of of Indo-Russian relations. Till the Cold War, when India and Russia and Soviet Union then were close buddies, we are still buddies at the moment, but it's still more complicated. But then it was multidimensional. Then our students used to go to Russia, our academics used to go to Russia, there used to be cultural festivals. Now nothing of that sort happens. The relationship is unidimensional, it's based on one thing, which is defense. So I think that role that culture played in sustaining that relationship, now that, because our youngsters are now going to the West is playing a more important role. So yes, there are multiple things happening. Geopolitically, West is getting weakened. But I think, again, 20 years down the line, these youngsters who are going to the West to study, they will be the leaders in these countries. And so China, as of yet, has not offered that vision that will produce anything which is, anywhere we can get closer to what we call as this Asian century.
I think that China is very smartly putting resources in trying to groom the elites which are loyal to China in some of the African states. We see that a lot in Central Asia. But they are targeting families and social groups which cannot afford American education and for which a switch from a Kyrgyz university to a Beida or Tsinghua, like top-ranked university in China, is definitely entering a different league, and that's all in China language. That makes you sort of loyal to China. But then majority of people still learn Chinese for pragmatic reasons. They might be attracted to characters, they might be attracted to Confucius or food, but that doesn't necessarily translate directly into them liking the Chinese state, the Chinese political state, or the Chinese foreign policy. I'm a big fan of China as a country, civilization, food and stuff, and I have some Chinese friends, but that doesn't necessarily make me be a big fan of what Communist Party of China does around the world. And I think that's the same problem with the West, that it overestimates, oh, look how strategic China is, how many Confucius institutes there are, how much money they are putting in, oh, so dangerous. But does it really convert somebody into liking China, or people are just going there opportunistically to learn Mandarin for free, and then, okay, we cannot talk about Xinjiang here, so what? We can talk about this at our university. So that's a different thing. Chinese are really trying to be attractive, but in fact they're not. Whereas the US did a lot of outrageous thing in this century and others, but still, freedom, non-discrimination, providing opportunities are very attractive, and the US was so smart in privatizing these Western ideas and making them American ideas. So I think it's still very attractive to many people around the world. Problem is that whether the US can really play the role, the bearer of the standard, and to provide model and can live up to its own ideals right now in an era of Trump. That's the big issue.
And Jens, you will have to focus now on the geopolitical challenges for China.
This one, managing relationship with the US. I think it's really not about confrontation, it's really about management and understanding, whether that's just Trump thing and Matt Pottinger and the people that Trump selected for his government and domestic politics in the US, or whether the US is in all-out containment mode.
All right, we have to be brief with the last three ones so that people can get their coffee.
Okay, I'll answer one of the questions. It links to the soft power and the geopolitical challenge. I think that the second wave of what is called Belt and Road is actually arriving in different continents of the world, including here in Europe. And it includes telecoms, banking, and retail from China. And the companies that are known for that are, for example, Alibaba, or Huawei, or Tencent, or WeChat. This kind of soft power exercise is very much data-driven, it's consumer-oriented, and there is a last constituency that is arriving in increasing numbers, and it cannot be stopped. And I think it will be a huge soft power influence in the future, and these are Chinese tourists.
So I think in terms of geopolitical musical chairs that's taking place, I think it's exciting, and soft power is very much part of the geopolitical game. The American dream, yes guys, it still resonates, but if you have a name like mine, Shada Islam. I'm not sure I'm going to the US in the next 4 or 5 years. I was there just before Trump took over. I left on 17th of January 2017. I'm not tempted to go back. So I have to say that part of America's soft power really has declined, and I'm being very blunt about that. The Chinese soft power, I would agree with Alex that it is very limited, and though it really appeals to the so-called strong men across the world and appeals to the military across the world, I don't think it appeals to people yet very much. But I have to say, ages ago when I was growing up in Pakistan, I had a choice between learning French or Chinese. I chose French. I ended up in Belgium, which is just as well, but friends of mine chose Chinese. And, so the Chinese soft power in terms of education has been there for a very long time. I want to come back to 3 things that worry me about the Asian century, and you talked about the grey rhinos or the black swans. One is religious and ethnic discrimination across Asia. Populism is contagious, authoritarianism is contagious, and wherever you look, you have minorities being discriminated against. We've just seen it with China and Xinjiang, where we have the Rohingya, we have the Christians in Pakistan, Muslims in India to some extent also, the Ahmadiyas. Across the board, there is strong religious and ethnic discrimination, which really, I think, is a fault line running through press restrictions, fake news, but also the number of journalists, honest journalists, who are being killed by government or terrorist organizations. That's an amazing fault line across Asia. And you cannot have a flourishing society if you do not have a free press. Fake news, let's not talk about it, is a different story altogether. And finally, women's leadership. I'm sorry to say, across Asia, women are still not do not still have the power they should have. Across the board, you have to see everywhere. I'm not just talking about the Muslim countries, I'm talking even about India. The hashtag #MeToo across Asia resonates. It's Japan, Korea, China, India, Pakistan, ASEAN, Indonesia, Philippines. You look at it and you know. And if we don't have women's leadership, if women are not in power, in the economic sector, in business, in politics, in society, this region is not going to flourish. Its potential will not be exploited to the full. And with that I want to end. Because I really think, we sit around here, what are we, 6 men, 1 woman? It's fine, it's okay, I can deal with it. But seriously, if we do not give women's leadership the role it deserves, and the United States as well, we're not going to have a flourishing global community, not just Asia Pacific or Eurasia. Yeah, thank you, Shada.
I give Shada the last word.
You're done? Okay, wonderful. I thank you all. I think it is not useful to summarize the conversation, but I like Shada's term that she just used, the geopolitical musical chairs that we played here. I think we did well on that one. And I would thank the panel and would like to offer all of you to give them a big hand for this amazing exercise.